It never ceases to amaze me how incredibly habituated we are to primitive superstitious beliefs, or should I say primitive spiritual beliefs. I mean, it's almost certainly the case that ever since we first looked up into the sky and wondered about our position in the universe, that we ascribed things in our environment to external supernatural forces, seeing the sun and moon themselves to be some supernatural beings, and wondering what force causes the water to fall downhill and causes the smoke to rise in the air. And although more modern religions tend to look down on these pagans and animists, if you look at the way they act and the way they worship, then basically they are no better in this regard. Instead, they merely ascribe all of those powers to a single source, for example, a creator god. But essentially, the way of thinking is the same. There's stuff that we just don't understand. And because we can't explain it, we want to give agency over to some higher force, some higher power. And so we explain it away with the god of the gaps, etc. Now, us Buddhists are supposed to be better in this regard. For example, we study philosophy and metaphysics, and we can give you all the logical reasons why it's not possible for there to be a pre-existent creator who's responsible for everything in the universe. Especially Western Buddhists, I might add, because to start off with, we have a foundation in scientific thinking, and we consider ourselves to be critical thinkers. But if you look at the way we practice, then again, it's no better than those primitive Neanderthals who are wondering what forces or what spirits were responsible for everything that moved in the universe. And you only have to look at those Western practitioners who see themselves to be special, our teachers on the spiritual path. You look at the way those people relate to the spiritual path, and essentially it's not really more advanced or any better than merely ascribing phenomenal powers to the spirits of the five elements, the sun and the moon. And why is it I say that it's the same? And that's because we have this strong belief that awakening is something that can be conferred upon us, like the bestowal of a blessing. These so-called advanced practitioners betray the narrative that they have some special insight into the spiritual path based on the way they explain their own experience. And so at this point, I'd better give you a couple of examples. Otherwise, you're not going to know what the hell I'm talking about. And the stories that come to mind are of pointing out instructions given by Tibetan teachers to their Western students. These Western students later went on to become teachers here in the West. They see themselves to have special experiences and also to be advanced practitioners. Now, you may or may not know what a pointing out instruction is, but in general, what this is a teacher pointing out to the student what is called the true nature of mind, or the true nature of phenomena. The best analogy I can come up with is of a mother pointing out to their child what the moon is. For example, a young child might hear the word moon and wonder what that is and ask mommy, what is the moon? And then the mother will take the child outside and point to the moon and say, that is the moon. It is pointing something out that up until that time you have not previously recognized. We may have linguistic references. For example, we may have heard the words, the true nature of phenomena, the true nature of mind, but up until that point, we haven't recognized what that is. So essentially, what a pointing out instruction is, it's pointing out a truth. It's pointing out a truth that appears to the direct perception of an ordinary individual. It's something they can see for themselves. And this is what the teacher's trying to do. It's trying to point to something. The analogy that's often given is that the teacher points to the moon, and what we do is we look at the finger instead of looking at the moon. The meaning of this is that what we tend to do is look at the method and miss the wisdom. So the method is the finger, that points at the moon. And what we're trying to do is recognize that. We're trying to have insight into what the moon is. But instead of looking at the moon, we look at the method, which is the finger. That's normally what we do, but that's not what this story is about. So there are these Western practitioners who went to the East decades ago when they encountered some Tibetan teachers. And these Tibetan teachers attempted to give them a pointing out instruction. That is, they attempted to show them what the nature of mind was, what the true nature of phenomena was. And one of these is very common. It's a story about the sound of a dog barking. In the scriptures, I think the story goes something like this. The teacher was frustrated because the student, up until that point, hadn't understood what the true nature was. And so he took the student out into the night to look at the stars. And then far in the distance, what they heard was the sound of a dog barking. And the teacher said, "Did you hear that?" The student replies, "Yes." And the teacher says, "That is the nature of mind." So this same instruction was given to a quite famous Western teacher from Britain. And then the way he related to this pointing out instruction demonstrates that he didn't understand what was being pointed out. He didn't recognize what the teacher was trying to show him. What he said was, it's very difficult to say exactly what happened at that time, but from that moment onwards, I felt like I had some special connection with the lineage and my teachers. This understanding follows the basic narrative that this Western teacher is trying to push. He's trying to push the idea that somehow the role of lineage holder was conferred upon him by his teacher, so that he was authorized to carry the lineage or the tradition that he was studying. Further, this demonstrates that the teacher himself doesn't understand what a lineage holder is. So we tend to think the position of a lineage holder is something that is bestowed upon us, like a title or a responsibility. For example, you could be made the ambassador of Switzerland, or you could be made a general in the army, something like that. But that's not the meaning of lineage holder. You're not being given the permission to represent the lineage. A lineage holder is somebody who has recognized the truth of that lineage. And so, for example, in Dzogchen or Mahamudra, there's a truth that we come to realize, and this becomes our practice. And somebody who has recognized that truth, in other words, somebody who is able to practice that, somebody who has understood the meaning of the Mahamudra or the Dzogchen, and then subsequently is able to practice that, becomes a lineage holder. The teacher is trying to get the student to recognize something that up until that point they haven't recognized, they haven't understood. And so this instruction is a way of pointing that out. And because this student, who is now a famous Western teacher, thought that a special connection with the lineage had been bestowed upon him, demonstrates how he himself doesn't understand what was being pointed out. And it's not only him. The interviewer in this story also got the same idea. They felt that this Tibetan teacher was somehow conferring something special upon him. For example, the interviewer asked, well, what's the difference if your teacher says that and an ordinary person says those same words? For example, do you hear the sound of that dog? That is the nature of mind. So they both had this impression that what the teacher did was something supernatural, that the teacher was using some special force or blessing to confer something upon the student. But that's not what the teacher was trying to do. The pointing out instruction, as I said previously, is the teacher trying to get the student to understand something. They're trying to get them to recognize something. And primarily, what they're trying to do is get them to recognize that up until that point, they've had a completely mistaken understanding about reality, about the way things are. What they're trying to get them to understand is that they have been following a false narrative all of their life. And it's once this false narrative has been undermined that student then is able to practice the path. That's when they become a lineage holder. And it was the same case in the second story, a second anecdote of a student receiving a pointing out instruction from their teacher. This was a Westerner who traveled to the East and studied with a famous Dzogchen meditation teacher. At some point, the teacher touched him on the back of the head and said, "Look here." Now, the student's take on this was to say, from that point onwards, I had a profound non-conceptual meditative experience that lasted for several days and then eventually faded away. So you can see by the way he spoke that he believed by his teacher touching him on the back of the head, something was conferred upon him. It was like the teacher was creating a special experience in his mind. And then after some time, the effects of that blessing, the effects of that empowerment wore off and no longer persisted. For example, now he doesn't have the same experience. Again, this is based on our belief in supernatural powers. That somehow the teacher themselves can transmit to us realization. For example, give us a taste of realization, and then, after some time, the power of this blessing wears off. Now, if someone were to become a lineage holder, that would mean that they had recognized what the teacher was trying to point out. And not only that, they would also be able to practice that. That means they would be able to abide in that truth. The point is, once you have seen the truth, you can never unsee it. It's not something that can fade away. So merely what happened in that interaction was the student was inspired by their teacher, and that gave them some brief moments of non-conceptual awareness. But of course, this is of no use to us on the spiritual path. This will not persist, and it will not help us to eventually become awakened. And you may interject and claim that in the scriptures it says that the Lama is the root of blessing. Well, this is true. But the blessing of the Lama isn't some supernatural power. It is not the ability to transmit realization to you. In fact, the Buddha said very clearly, I cannot wash away your sins with water. These hands cannot remove your negativity. And realization is not something that can be transferred from my mind to yours. I can merely teach you the path to liberation, but you alone must tread that path. In fact, we believe the Buddha was the most highly realized being that has ever existed and could potentially ever exist. And not only that, a Buddha is what is called a great bodhisattva. That is somebody who has limitless compassion for all sentient beings. So if it was the case that a teacher could confer blessing upon us, and through that blessing we could progress on the spiritual path to awakening, and in this way overcome our suffering, then why on earth wouldn't the Buddha do that for all sentient beings? There's no one with more spiritual power than a Buddha. And not only that, there is no one with greater compassion than the Buddha. And so why would the Buddha allow us to continue to suffer in the 6 realms of samsara? Surely, if it was the case that an enlightened being could transfer their realization to us, then they would make it so that we would no longer have to suffer. In fact, this question often sprung to mind when I contemplated the meaning of the Christian religion. I wondered why God would allow us to suffer, if indeed God was responsible for everything in the universe. But the problem here is that most people have never encountered the instructions on mind training. In fact, it's a very rare and special interaction, and one that I hope you someday may be able to encounter. But until that day comes, I encourage you to remain critical. And when I say critical, I mean also remain critical of the Buddha Dharma. Don't accept things on face value, and investigate for yourself, using your powers of reasoning to contemplate whether or not something is a valid statement. It's through this process that eventually you may come to understand or recognize the true nature of reality. And once that has happened, you will always have something to practice and a potential path to spiritual awakening. And it is my wish that you should achieve this exalted state, but not only for your own benefit and to escape your own mundane suffering, rather for the benefit of all sentient beings who are as limitless as space is vast. And so until next time, see you later.